Hi, everybody. Welcome to Off the Record episode number 2. We got a lot of great feedback and some nice listens from the first episode, and we appreciate that a lot. One thing was when we taped it, we didn't quite have our website set up. So for anyone looking to find us online, you can go to offtherecord.fm or follow us on Twitter at offtherecordfm. Also, whenever I listen to podcasts, I appreciate a lot when the podcasters sort of write up a running script of what was talked about on the episode, and that would be called show notes. So if you want to find any of the show notes to keep along and dig into links with us, you can go to offtherecord.com/tagged/episodes. Great. So first up today would be a discussion popped up online this week about whether a band like 5 Seconds of Summer can sort of cross back pop punk into the mainstream world. Have you listened to that band, Jesse?
I sadly did. And while I could totally admit that I have a guilty pleasure, I'm gonna publicly embarrass myself. I really like One Direction, One Thing. I think that's a great song. That stuff is really terrible.
Well, the interesting thing about 5 Seconds of Summer in like specific is that they co-wrote and they recorded with John Feldman and Alex Gaskarth from All Time Low and the dude from Boys Like Girls and a bunch of other guys. So they're from Australia, but they truly like pop punk, which is interesting. Like they all have those writing credits down. But so Alt Press wrote an article sort of saying that this band might be really important to pop punk again, and then Thomas from Absolute Punk wrote sort of a response article saying 5 Seconds of Summer kind of isn't that important to pop punk, but there might be some other bands that are. And I thought it was an interesting discussion because I started talking with a different Jesse that writes for my website, and he brought up to him, well, Blink-182 was just the 5 Seconds of Summer of his generation. And you're from that same generation as him, but you don't quite agree on that, right?
I don't. So my thing with what punk rock is, and obviously, like when you get into these discussions, I'm never going to pretend that I'm right and somebody's wrong. Punk is whatever you want to say. But to me, and what I identify was I read this quote from Joe Strummer about a year ago, and so that's 19 years into my punk rock existence, where he said, punk rock, it is the attitude. It's the don't give me any bullshit because I can see right through the heart of the situation attitude because I'm wise to the tricks of the world. We're sick of all the bullshit. Give us some truth. That's the energy of punk rock. So to me, what punk rock is when you're saying something that's super, super real and doing something that's super true and more real than what the rest of reality is. Like, I saw that movie, Palo Alto last night. And man, it's so good. But it was like when I first saw the movie Kids, that was more real than anything anybody was saying. Palo Alto last night was more real than what anybody's saying. And the difference between why I think Blink-182 is punk and why I don't think 5 Seconds of Summer is because 5 Seconds of Summer is like pandering. They know when they sing about an American Apparel shirt that they're pandering and trying to get it. It was the same reason, and the funny thing is, I don't think All Time Low is punk at all. When they're doing photo shoots with their fucking shirts off in a pool, they're popping a fucking champagne bottle on the cover of the record. It's fucking pandering bullshit trying to market a fucking lifestyle. I don't find that fucking punk, and I don't find this punk. But when Blink-182 was singing stupid lyrics, it was more real because that's what people thought, and what kids thought. Some people were like, oh, they're too old, but I felt those things and I'm near their age and I still feel those things. And
So Blink, though, I mean, Blink also did the whole, and All Time Low completely just took it from them. Blink did 15 years ago that whole sort of like half naked thing or whatever, and it wasn't on an album cover, but it was on every music video, and they were if you ask them, they were doing that to sort of like mock the Backstreet Boys or mocking Sync or whatever, but I guess with someone like All Time Low 10 years later tapping into that is a more pandering thing than, hey, we're clearly poking fun at NSYNC running down a street or running down a beach naked.
Yeah, I mean, Travis Barker plays every show. And I'm not saying when you take off your shirt, like, Fat Mike plays shirtless. Like, there's a thing that with Blink
Beautiful thing.
182. Oh, God. Um, there's a thing with Blink 182 that, like, it felt like real. It felt rebellious and real. And, like, they were telling a truth that they didn't see in the world. And, like, one of my big things is that every group I've ever worked with that makes great music that people identify with, and like I even put Limp Bizkit, like the record I did with them, into this, is that they just make the music they want to hear, and that's when people want to hear music. And when bands get terrible, and I like, like in my new book, I kind of use Blink 182 as an example of like, I think one of the reasons like they had to do self-titles, they didn't feel like singing about dog farts anymore, and that's the real and that's the punk thing, is like it's not gratuitous rebellion and it's not gratuitous let's get girls into our band by posing with our shirts off and showing off our hot tops. Like, to me, that's bullshit, and singing about how good a girl looks in an American Apparel shirt is total fucking bullshit.
That's fair. I think the more interesting thing about those articles that went around this week was sort of a step further. If you could get beyond, arguing about 5 Seconds of Summer, and like a couple hundred people did that love 5 Seconds of Summer did attack me on Twitter, which was fun this
It
week.
was hilarious.
But I think the interesting thing, a level deeper in that writing was, like, can pop punk become a mainstream thing again? And when pop punk was a mainstream thing, I was in like third to sixth grade, and it wasn't really something that I could understand anything different from anything else on the radio. But ever since that Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco era sort of subsided, we haven't seen anyone like this on the radio again. And so Alt Press's article was about, well, maybe 5 Seconds of Summer can get someone like All Time Low on the radio. And Thomas from Absolute Punk point was, actually, A Day to Remember could be that band instead.
Yeah.
What direction could you see it being the actual one to happen again,
I, I,
if any?
I think that it's different than both of those. I think that what it is we live, in this democratization of music that we have now, is that somebody's just going to write a great record. Like, no one could have predicted Lord. No one could have predicted Gautier's, someone I used to know. Those weren't things that were in the cards. And I think somebody's just going to write a great record, and they're going to have a great team, and that's going to go big. I mean, who would have predicted that Issues would have had a song in the top 40?
Yeah, no, they
Like,
hit it out of the park.
and like, I think it's really a matter these days, of that we have a democratization of music, and somebody can write a record that good that does it. I could see, I mean, A Day to Remember is just so massive and big. I mean, it's possible it could be them, but I think that is the thing. But, and there is an interesting thing that, like, it takes more than one band to bring everything up. Like, it wasn't just I obviously lived through the Nirvana thing, and that took Nirvana and Pearl Jam being. It needs to be more than one band. It's the same reason, like, you don't see, like, even when Rolling Stone does articles on Lorde, and she's writing about Mount Kimby and like all these obscure indie rock bands like Lo-Fang and all that stuff, they're not getting that big off of it because Lorde isn't a movement yet. She's just
Right, she's
an
just
anomaly.
one person that's
Yeah.
currently standing out that everyone can get behind.
Yeah.
But there needs to be a second and a third and a fourth. I think that's pretty interesting because, to me, I hadn't. I guess 5 Seconds of Summer is on the radio, or certainly One Direction is, but even a few years removed, that kind of music wasn't necessarily on the radio, as far as I know. And so I
Well,
could foreseeably see an All Time Low song following that up, but at the same time, I don't know if I could see that.
I don't think All Time Low writes good enough songs, but that's just me. But interesting thing though, when you talk about One Direction, keep in mind One Direction is not on the radio. One Direction only has one top 40 song.
It's interesting.
So they're this anomaly, and Lefsitz, as flawed as he is, actually wrote a great article about this. That they're the weird anomaly of what internet really is these days, and how powerful the internet is. Is that One Direction's arguably one of the biggest bands in the world right now, but they're not fueled by singles and they're not fueled by radio. They're fueled by what do you call it? Like the an internet and music consumption on streaming and iTunes downloads and like kind of like the Twitter thing. And that's what they're all about these days. And you don't have to be paying money to a radio promotion thing to be the one of the biggest bands in the world anymore. And that's what's so different about music today compared to 20 years ago.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Or
I
even
agree.
5 years. There was no record of a band being this big off of something like off of no radio hits. Like you would at least get pushed up into the top 40 with the sales, but they're an exception.
And it would seem to someone that doesn't listen to the radio at all, like me, I guess, that
Yeah.
they would have, a new hit every month because they are a band that can sell out an entire tour in, in a minute or
Yeah.
less.
Yeah, totally.
And it's just power. To me, the Day to Remember angle is interesting as well, just because it's obviously more rock geared. And like you mentioned, Issues, a label like Rise Records, is continuing to have more and more success. Where some of these bands like Of Mice and Men or Issues start out much more, I guess, metalcore sounding with screaming or whatever, but then sort of get watered down into a more friendly sound, like a Sleeping with Sirens.
Mhm.
And they sold 70,000 records week one. They're
Yeah.
obviously not on the radio, but that's a direction that I could see more viable is if and when rock sort of ticks back on, that those bands on Rise as they continue to grow. Billboard just wrote a whole article profiling them, and
Yeah.
even though they were wrong on the revenues numbers and just took a guess, like it's clear that something's in the water there, and that there is music is growing and growing again, with or without radio.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the numbers, like it's actually funny. I was talking to a friend who works in radio about how all the Nielsen things that the radio stations are actually arguing against Nielsen from publishing numbers now
Oh
because
wow.
they don't want people to know how much radio has died, which is just stunning. And it's that thing of like, I actually am somebody who enjoys putting on the radio when I rent a Zip car because I want to know and understand it, but like, it really is that thing of who even outside of like punk circles, like, my like father is the only person I know who listens to the radio all day.
Right. Well, he's a strong man. So I guess that's a good transition, though, just into the article that you threw our way, saying that the problem of music has been solved by the internet. And 20 years ago, Steve Albini, who's I guess best known for working with Nirvana among many other
Yeah.
bands, wrote an essay called "The Problem with Music." So, do you want to explain that, or
So
the original premise, I guess?
yeah, so Steve Albini, who, a brilliant mind and probably one of the, arguably most definitive producers of the modern era, wrote this. He wrote a couple of great articles. One of them, aside from this, was called "Some of Your Friends May Already Be This Fucked," about what it's like to sign to a major label. Anything he's ever committed to paper is worth Googling, because they're always some of the most poignant articles. I can literally remember like there's not many articles I can remember like where I was sitting when I read this article, but the problem with music, he basically talked about how the whole system is rigged and boiled it all down to that, like, all the people who make money off of music are the wrong people. That anybody doing good by music is the person who doesn't do it. But he now says that that's been solved by the internet, which is kind of what we're talking about, is that you're now able to have these Macklemores, and like while Macklemore gets this like stupid thing about like, is he DIY or not? And there's a 20 think piece articles about this you can read. No matter what, the difference between Macklemore and everybody else is Macklemore doesn't have to answer to a board when he says he wants to talk about gay rights in a song, and he gets more of his profits that he can invest back into his music and his promotion. And you're not dividing the pie in the same stupid way that the pie used to be divided, and that's because of the internet. And he talks about like the two greatest innovations in his lifetime have been punk rock and the internet. And just like we were talking about with One Direction, is that it's stunning that you can be a band and make a living and not have any, MTV's not a viable thing. Like, while I think YouTube is one of the most viable things, you don't even need YouTube. You can choose. There can be so many different outlets and ways you can go about music promotion when back in the day there was about 3 if you wanted to be a semi-successful band that made a living off of music.
So there's that avenue though, and One Direction's the cream of the crop of that, where they're so big it doesn't matter. And then there's Macklemore, who's also so big, but he does things more on his own, whether it's completely DIY or not. But then I don't where I find issue with saying that the problem of music has been solved by the internet is that there are a lot of models now that record labels employ that are major problems. A lot of labels in our immediate, punk scene now employ a 360 model, and they argue on that front that it's strictly because of the internet, and it's because your record only sells 50,000 copies now if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, right? And versus maybe that 50,000 would have been 250,000, but because we need to give you a really nice budget to record your album and we need to market it and blah, 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 then those labels now feel like they need to take cuts of a touring band, a band that, let's say, is only tops is going to play a 2,000 cap room tour. So if you're in New York, like a Terminal 5 or a Philly, an Electric Factory. And so a label may say, well, hey, you're touring off of this success now. You're obviously doing well. Your albums aren't selling that much, but they're clearly being listened to somehow. We're going to dig into your touring, your touring success in terms of your money brought in. We're going to take a cut of that, and also your online merch, since you're a band that sells a lot of merch. We're going to take a cut of that now as well.
Yeah, and you as I can feel for the label side of it is that, how are they supposed to make money when no one's downloading music? And especially if, as we'll get into later, downloads may be a thing of the past soon. But I do you feel like 360s are the norm? Or, because when I see 360s aren't the norm, though. I think that they're the exception to the rule. Or am I not
I
seeing
don't
that
know.
right?
I think it with our, and I can only, I don't know in terms of the whole world of record labels, but I think just from knowing when I have shopped individual deals, or I have talked with other managers about individual deals, it kind of does seem like it's about a 50-50 thing, where a label that you might think, oh, there's no way they do. Well, actually they do. And whether you can negotiate a label out of that or not is one thing. But, a lot of them offer it to start out, because why wouldn't you? And some bands just agree to them because, they don't have the right team or something else. And so if that, stupid 18-year-old band agrees to a 360 deal, and then 2 years later when they release their first album sort of blow up, whether that means they sell a lot of online merch or they're getting really good touring, that they're tapping into that 360 early. And for those who don't know how a lot of 360s work, is it's not that the minute that you sign, let's say 10% of everything that you make goes to the label. It works in a system of thresholds. So band X, once they hit a revenue number of $100,000 on touring, or $100,000 on online merchandise, after that point, when it turns into $100,001, that's when the record label starts to take a cut. And I know like $100,000 sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's really not that much. And it's not that much past a few years, if that at all, if past a few months. You make a lot of, there's a potential to make a lot of money as a band. And $100,000, if you're a successful band, is really nothing. And especially once a record label takes 10 and a manager takes 15 and a business manager takes 5 and so on like that, suddenly you're just getting chopped down. And so I feel like a lot of the problems with the music with the internet has been chopped down, but a whole bunch pop more up.
Yeah.
There we go.
I think that one of the better points here too is that there is revenue coming in now, and there's so many people talk about how bands aren't, there's no way to make money as a band, and there is, but the problem is that there's this ever long struggle of that as that money comes in, every label figures out how to get it, and every lawyer changes their percentages and all these things, and people are constantly trying to figure out how to do that. And for the musicians listening out here, it's a big war. Like, like I am stunned. I heard of a label recently that doesn't somehow in their contracts, they don't pay the bands their YouTube revenue.
See, yeah, and that's great, and that, good
That's
for that label, right?
yeah. And it just blew me away. And it's like, I think is like, like we were talking about this article on Rise, and Clyde Smith from Fluxus Research and Hypebot wrote about, like, that's one of the big secrets of how Rise did it. And like, if there's anything I see that bands, especially in the punk scene, are doing, is like any band who's not making YouTube their number one priority is a fool, because it's the number one way people discover new music, and there's so much money to be made off those YouTube royalties.
Yeah, it's so important. Rise, for example, they are the most successful independent label in the world on YouTube in terms of subscribers and stuff like that. And it's, that's actually like kind of their whole business. Sure, like a lot of their records now are selling really well, but that wasn't necessarily the case 2 or 3 years ago. And, the YouTube is sort of, I think, the byproduct of why their records are now killing it, like week 1 or week 2, whatever, with Sleeping with Sirens or an issue of Mice and Men. These bands have had, years to develop now online. And if you click through Rise's YouTube page, almost all of Sleeping with Sirens, like recent music videos, have like 20 million views, and that's crazy.
Wow.
And that's why they're selling 70,000 copies of their record in a week. So YouTube is something that's so important. Even with Knucklepuck, for example, when I stepped in, I was so happy to see that they had a YouTube page set up and they had all their stuff on there. And I was like, well, this is great. Like, this is an important step. I'm happy to see some bands that are pretty inexperienced can take note of that and are doing that themselves. And I think Rise sort of made it clear to a lot of people too that you have to do that. But it would be crazy, like you were saying, if a band would sign a deal where they didn't see a percentage of that YouTube stuff, because that can be so much money.
Yeah, and it really is funny, because I think, like, after that article this week, I think like every kid's gonna perk up of every label, like and they're gonna start going, oh, we have to up our YouTube game, because that's a visible thing that Rise is doing that everybody can see, is they really take it seriously. And like, Jeff at Run for Cover, smart enough to have Alex from Basement basically devoted to putting up videos all day.
Right, and it's YouTube. So important. Something like Tuesdays with Tay, they're developing a sense of community with their label. I think that's a pretty good distinction from what Rise is doing, right? Rise just throws up the music. Rise pays a person in-house to do lyric videos because they're really important to them. And that's sort of their method. And there's, clearly that's great for them. It works perfectly. But, Run for Cover's on a much smaller scale. So instead, they have someone like Alex who plays in Basement but is great with video. He'll do a lot of their music videos, but then he does all these other things as well. So Tuesdays with Tay is sort of the great example of that. And then they do a few other things called Small Talk or Gear Talk, or a few other series where, they're showing their really excitable, kind of Tumblr community, all these different ways that the label is bringing them entertainment. And it doesn't have to just literally be a new song. It can be, I'm going to take 7 minutes out of my day today to listen to this guy who works at this record label answer dumb questions, and it's worked. I watch it every single Tuesday and I love it.
Yeah.
So I think it's great.
And I think those two are totally like the future of what we're going to see, every other label is going to be following that. And like the other thing I think that's really interesting that a lot of people my age don't get, like I often show people, Jack Conti, the CEO of Patreon and member of that band Pomplamoose, he hosts chats with his fans in the YouTube comments, because then it raises their SEO. And it's like that funny thing of like, that's not one of the things that people immediately see as visible. But like, when you're talking about like the difference of getting people into your band, like if you're not coming up high on searches, like you're not doing, like, like when I see a band name themselves something like a town's name or something, it's like, you're an idiot, because you're never like, it's like that funny thing. I used to manage a band called Washington Square Park. And I came into it, after they'd been a band for a while, but it was like, okay, great. We're never going to come up on Google. We're never going to come up on YouTube ever in the history of anything.
Right, and
And
something like that guy does, it's a perfect thing to, one, actually communicate with the people that are interested in talking with you, great, and then two, also raise the chance of someone else stumbling upon your video.
yeah, and I think the greater point I want to make is people don't understand, because I think there's a greater conversation we had is that, like, when you don't do it or you don't have a friend who does it, you think it doesn't exist in this world, especially music business people. They're like, well, I don't know anybody who does that. It's like, great. Well, guess what? There's tens of millions of people who literally use YouTube comments as a message board these days and spend their days commenting. I don't know who these freaks are, but they're willing to consume your music and be a fan of your music, and they're commenting, and it helps you. So embrace it and do everything you can to pour gas on that spark.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's great now that there are so many different ways for me to talk to a band I want to talk to. And so it's kind of foolish of a band, or definitely a record label, to not take control of that, especially if there is a question like the problem of music, how do we avoid it, or how do we get around it? And there are clearly answers. It's tough to do. That's the thing. I was answering an email sort of interview for someone that was doing a class project in college, and they needed to speak with someone's work that they followed in the greater sort of music industry. And one of the questions was, and I bet everyone who gets an interview like this, you too, gets asked, like, how do you do what you do, or how do you get to the place where you want to? And every time I get that question, I just answer, like, you just have to, like, you just literally have to do it.
Yeah.
You see, like, what I'm doing, or what person X or Y is doing, like, I know it seems hard, and I know you don't know how to do it, but that person that you want to model yourself over, like, after, they didn't know how to do it either,
No.
So how did they do it? And it's just a simple thing of, clearly, if someone else can do it, unless they have some sort of gift that you don't, like, you can do it as well.
Yeah.
So if it's a record label seeing Tuesdays with Tay from Run for Cover and being like, this is great, I'm going to just copy this, you probably shouldn't do that, but you should probably spend the extra hour or two thinking about, what you could do that could get your community of fans and, record buyers or whatever really excited too. And it's your own creativity, and creativity is hard, and it's supposed to be hard. But if you put in that extra legwork, like, it's gonna have its success, and that's great for you.
Yeah, and, like, I think, so Jeff Bezos, from the CEO of Amazon, has that saying that we haven't even woken up on the first day of the internet's history yet, and we haven't even woken up on the potential for YouTube. Like, I even talk. It's funny. I talk in my book, Get More Fans, about a YouTube channel literally can be anything you want to curate, and, like, people aren't even doing the things, like, if like you're like somebody who likes dumb viral videos, every month make a playlist of those dumb viral videos and share it on your channel, and, like, let your fans bond with you, like, through that. Like, anything you can think of that's cool. Like, if you're a big fan of rap battles or whatever, make a playlist of it, share it, make a video talking about what you like about it. Like, there is no band I see using their YouTube video or using their YouTube channel to the extent that you can use it and really, really, like, make a big thing in community with your band. And, like, we're not even at the tip of the iceberg of what could be done with this technology.
Yeah, and that's a plus, not a negative, obviously.
Yeah.
And even something, again, like Rise, or any band, like, we're seeing now, again, all these smaller bands sell a lot larger numbers than they were doing like a year ago, and getting more and more fans, or touring better, quicker. And that's because some of these technologies or avenues are sort of growing up a little bit,
Yeah.
but they haven't they haven't hit their stride yet, and that potentially means really big things. Whether it's like another band like One Direction, who can sort of just do this whole thing without without radio, or something else, 100,000 records first week, whatever. But it's great that there's these solidified avenues now, like Tumblr or YouTube or Twitter, and most of them haven't even hit their stride yet. And that means the people using it, the bands using it, the bloggers, whatever, they haven't hit their stride yet either.
Yeah, it's true. And like even like the other great thing is like this stuff keeps going up. Like last week, I guess it was that SoundCloud put up analytics, and you can now see where people are listening to your SoundCloud. And this used to be the only good thing about MySpace is MySpace analytics were so unbelievably good. Like, man, I'll tell you, like early days of planning Man Overboard stuff, like we learned like we weren't playing cities where we had a lot of fans with MySpace analytics. And
Right, exactly. And so I think I saw this too, that I don't know, Hypebot or someone was like, you can now plan your tours via SoundCloud. And sort of the gist of that is, maybe no one is listening to you in this town in Houston, Texas, but a lot of people are in Dallas. So why don't you go to Dallas this time instead?
It's funny they say that's because this technology, whether it's you've been able to do this with Next Big Sound. I mean, the Nielsen SoundScan. In 1996, this is a really funny story. Might have been 97. I booked a club called the Pipeline in Newark, New Jersey, and when bands would come to us trying to get us to book their tours, and we decide if their guarantee was good enough, we pull Nielsen SoundScan. I can remember we were booking a show for AFI. And AFI had sold something like 30,000 of their first record in California and 19 copies in New York. And they wanted like a huge guarantee. We were like, fuck off. And sure enough, there was 10 people there. And, I was the sound man and I was up front headbanging because I loved the band. I wanted to give them all the money in the world. But they even, not to be a dick, but they asked for a bodyguard, which I probably shouldn't be outing. And we were like, yeah, I'll get like a passed out drunk kid to sit by your dressing room. Don't you worry about it.
It was Newark. I don't know that request wasn't fair.
there was reason for that. I definitely got mugged getting H2O towels one time on a 2-block walk. But no, they were literally worried about fans. And it was like, yeah, there's no one at that show at all.
Yeah.
And, but like, that's the funny thing is this technology has been around and you've been able to see on SoundScan this technology for as long as since 97. But, the music business also, like, another one of these things that, like, kind of getting to that rise thing and, like, people don't pay attention to the things they should be doing is music business is a lot of people who like to party and don't like to do innovative things. Like, they can talk all day about liking to do innovative things, but really at the end of the day, this is a lazy man's industry. And if you are a hardworking person, you're so far ahead of the curve. And never mind if you embrace new technology, you're so far ahead of people that it's not even funny. Like, it's definitely the running in the Special Olympics when you don't have a disorder.
Yeah. What was that movie? That's probably a good time for a sponsor break.
Yeah. So Bad Timing Records is our sponsor today, which is a record label run out of a bedroom of 2 bedrooms in New York and Philadelphia. You can go to badtimingrecords.com to check out vinyl releases from Valencia, Acceptance, Mansions, and many more coming this summer. I've been mastering these records, so I can tell you some of the ones that are coming are really, really awesome. Make sure to type in the code OTR10 for 10% off any order before the discount ends on May 31st.
Cool. So the big thing that kind of blew up on Thursday, I guess it was Thursday, was a report came out from the Wall Street Journal that Apple is reportedly buying Beats to the tune of $3.2 billion. And that was a shock to, I think, truly everyone. And so a few quick things to look at before jumping in are Apple's largest acquisition ever came 20 years ago, and it was for $400 million, which 20 years later with inflation is $600 million. So still nowhere even in the realm of this price tag.
What was that? That was Next?
Yeah, it was Next, which of course is why Apple is now here today. And for anyone that doesn't know, Next, without nerding out too much, Next was a company that Steve Jobs started after he was banished from Apple. Apple was about to go out of business, and they had like 90 days left of cash. They bought Next. Next came in, and that's sort of how Apple transitioned into the OS X, iPod, iPhone Apple of today. And so that move obviously was a huge one for them. But Apple is a company that traditionally doesn't make huge acquisitions. They make a lot of acquisitions. They made 24 within the last year, but most of them are not really large established companies. Apple likes to take a team's philosophy or software or whatever and sort of embed it within Apple's own products or future products. So to be talking about or potentially buying a very solidified company like Beats, who have an average revenue per year about $1 billion and a valuation of about $1 billion, to buy that is a huge thing. What was your sort of initial reaction?
Well, the thing that I was most interested in was that, so they're now going to own Beats Music streaming service, which is as we talked about last week, I'm definitely a fan of, but like, so what happens? Do they shut down iTunes and downloads? And, there was a great quote in that article we were talking about on Quartz about Steve Albini and the music industry that, hilariously, John Bon Jovi, the big thinker he is, blamed Steve Jobs for the death of the music business. I mean, what's the music? The really funny thing about this is you're talking about Jimmy Iovine, who's one of the heads of a major label. What if Apple just throws away iTunes downloads and throws away all that revenue, or do they keep this and keep getting your father, who still downloads music to his iPod and buys music instead of using a Spotify or a Beats or an audio? What's the move here? That's the thing I'm so curious about, is like, so you're going to have a streaming service, you're going to have iTunes Match and this download thing. Like, what is the move here?
Well, so that's what we started texting about the other day, and we were kind of unsure. Like, well, are they just buying Beats Music, or are they
Mhm.
buying the headphones? And then it quickly was realized, oh no, of course it's the whole entire thing.
Mhm.
And so as sort of people have had time to digest the news instead of sort of just freaking out with random articles, a lot have come out being like, actually, Apple probably doesn't care about the streaming side of Beats much at all.
Hmm.
And if that's the case, like, there's a lot of discussion that it's mostly about the hardware. So I personally have never worn or used a pair of Beats. I know that everyone thinks that they are terrible. I would assume you are the best judge of that. But at
Uh,
the same time, answer along with that, are they less terrible than Apple's own earbuds?
so, as an audio dork who owns a $500 pair of headphones, in Chicago, I was waiting for my girlfriend to get out of work, and there was a store that allowed you to blind test headphones. Funny thing is, I plugged in my phone, listened, and the guy literally put a blindfold on me and put them on me. Um, Out of a bunch of headphones under $200, I chose the Beats blind tested. I do think they're better than the Apple ones, but I'm a big fan of the Apple. The Apple ones have gotten much better in quality over the years, and for something that's easy to strap on, it's great. But they color the sound, and as somebody, to get into a greater discussion, as an audio engineer and somebody who appreciates music, I don't think you should alter the EQ curve that a producer chooses for the record and a mastering engineer chooses for the record that greatly. And they alter that EQ curve so much that I have to own a pair of Beats just so I know when somebody calls me about a master, if the reason the master sounds terrible is because they're listening on Beats. And a lot of the time, that's the thing, is like when you're on big bass music, that EQ curve gets really, really gross and away from the producer's intent.
Right.
And so
So
there's
that's interesting, but I don't know. To me, music, as Apple frequently says, is in their DNA.
Yep.
They often hold an own sort of big event just about music, just about whether it's an iPod or an iTunes radio, whether that's been a success or a failure. Apple clearly cares about music. The iPod was changed the world. iTunes changed the world. And I read a bunch of interesting thoughts that Beats is the iPod of today, or Beats is the iTunes of today in terms of a brand that screams music.
Mhm.
I don't know. There are two headphones that I know of when I am in a subway or walking down the street. Right,
Yep.
they're the white ones by Apple. They're earbuds, or they're Beats. If you're wearing a different kind of over the ear or in ear headphones, I have no idea what they are unless they're earbuds from Apple or Beats,
Yeah.
by Dre. Those are the only two I know. And Apple is, a lifestyle or an experience or a brand kind of company. And Beats, in terms of music, they might be the loudest next to the iPod in terms of most recognizable, you know? So if
Oh
you
yeah.
think about it from a purely hardware perspective, and Apple is a hardware company. They're not a software company; they're a hardware company. That's where they
Mhm.
make all of their money. So what if suddenly you now have the option to buy, an iPhone with Beats, or they come with Beats, or something like that. Then that's a win-win. You know what? Now every pair of Beats you see walking down the street, that's Apple,
Yeah.
and
And
and that's huge.
Beats has 85% of the market share, even with the Apple headphone coming with every iPhone.
Right.
But there's also the thing that Beats also come with Androids, which is also an interesting thing because I'm sure that tie is going to be
Yeah,
severed
well,
very fast.
HTC used to own Beats, and they were
Oh, I didn't
bought.
realize that.
Yeah, yeah. HTC was sort of bought Beats, or a large stake in it, and so Beats's technology was put into every HTC Android phone for a while, and that deal kind of ended. But that was what that was. What's peculiar, or we will soon find out if the deal does happen, is that Apple has a lot of subcategories, right? They have the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad,
Mhm.
whatever. They've never, though, bought a different company and made that brand one of their categories. So, again, you have an iPod and you have earbuds, but Apple has never before bought a company and suddenly sold their product as their own. What Apple typically does is they buy a company, they shut it down, and they repurpose that technology somehow.
Yeah.
So it would be really, it would be curious if Apple were to buy Beats for $3.2 billion, and suddenly all Beats were taken off the market, and a year later they came out with a new line of headphones, titled something else. But it would also be weird if Apple just started selling Beats as their own, only because Apple has never done that before. So it's really, I don't know. There's so many different variables and so many different things to think about in terms of how does this even work. It's just a bizarre move on all fronts, I think. Right?
Yeah. No. And New York Magazine made one of the stupidest comments. They're like, "What is Johnny Ive going to even do with a Beats? Like, how can he do that?" It's like, this is like one of the greatest geniuses in design. Like, he'll do fine. And even the stuff he did before Apple was all great hardware stuff that looked amazing. And I'm really curious to is it going to be Beats by Apple?
Right. Yeah. Or do they, again, like, I don't know why they would ever, if they bought Beats, it would be so strange to sort of to shut it down, right? And to
Yeah.
So it feels like they want Beats because they want that brand, and music is important to them. And it's, as the iPod sells less and less down to zero, it is still really important for Apple to have music as their thing, right? And so, if more and more people suddenly have a Beats, a headphone on them on the bus or train or whatever and work, then that's Apple won that category again.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing is too is like as the iPod diminishes, but there's the big argument that only a certain amount of the market ever is going to own an iPhone, because of its closed nature. But they keep defying that, and you and I are humongous Apple fanboys, obviously, and
Yeah, we're
you,
we're the exception to everything about a lot of things that we
yeah,
would talk about. But I don't know. I agree. With this, another thing I read was, if you think about when Apple pivoted and put iTunes on Windows, that sealed the game. If Apple didn't do that, someone else would have, and they would have never sort of won the whole battle for the iPod, for the MP3 player. But they did do that, and then it was game over because everyone started to use iTunes, and then everyone bought an iPod. And if they want to take Beats and use the brand for what it is now and not sort of dice it up, there's no reason, if you own an Android or a Windows phone, that you can't buy Beats anymore. And that would again be another win, I think, for Apple and for Beats, if that continues to just be everywhere.
yeah, and I think like one of the more interesting things I was thinking about this morning too is I wonder if they've seen some numbers because one of the other interesting things is every Windows computer now comes with Xbox Music, which while we talk about Beats, Spotify, and Rdio being the big streaming, Xbox Music is basically the same thing, and it comes with every Windows computer, and they now have a direct competitor to that as well, if that's coming with every new Mac. And that also solves a lot of Beats problems of the fact that they don't have a free option like Spotify and Rdio, and they're going to literally just put this packaged in with every iPhone and every Mac device. That's a huge thing and comes with so many subscribers and is a really, really big thing.
Yeah, and so that's the other part of this, of course. Like we've just been talking about hardware, but you started talking about streaming.
Mhm.
And a lot of sort of first initial reactions were like, well, why not RDO, Apple? Why not buy RDO? You know?
Mhm.
And that's when I think people started realizing that, well, maybe a lot of it's about hardware. But regarding the actual software Beats Music, Beats only has somewhere between 100 and 200,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
Apple has 800 million iTunes accounts. They have 800 million credit cards dialed in. So clearly, Apple's not buying Beats for those streaming numbers, you know.
Mhm.
But maybe they do want Beats music rather for iTunes stream, let's call it, you know, whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know. I think it would be an easy way for Apple to just sort of shuffle in a new streaming service and to code it with whatever kind of paint they want to use for what it's called or what it looks like. Because of course Beats was originally Mog, but at the
Mhm.
same time, like I don't know that Apple couldn't just build this themselves.
Apple could build it themselves, but so one of the interesting things is a good friend of mine was the lawyer that negotiated all of Mog's counts with labels and stuff like that, and that costs hundreds of millions of dollars just the lawyering of getting all this stuff to work. So
Right.
them buying this just basically solved development time that they don't have to put into it, and it's that thing of, with startups is just sometimes it's easier to buy something that's already has the technology there, and then you just do a few tweaks to get it to work with your thing, and that's that. And they have a fantastic service. Beats is, as I wrote in my article for Property of Zack, I think it's great. It's just missing one or two features that would be amazing, and they need to have a way to export your playlist from Spotify and RDO into Beats. I was looking for that for a friend this morning, and it just does not exist, and that's a real tragic flaw.
Yeah. I mean, so would you be happy to use a streaming service by Apple,
Oh,
or are you happy with RDO or Spotify or whatever you use?
I use RDO, and I would love to switch from RDO, but I'm addicted to the new releases page each week,
Right.
and because Beats doesn't have that, I can't switch over. Because that's basically how I consume music every week is scrolling through that and seeing what the new releases are. I would call that new releases page one of the greatest innovations of music in the history of music. Is that every week I can just say, all right, Pitchfork's yelling about this band, Property of Zack's yelling about that band. They have a new record. Let's see how it sounds. I take some time every week to scroll through that, and it's for somebody who grew up buying CDs and having to buy them to hear them, that's the greatest innovation in music of the last 20 years for me.
So let's say Apple buys Beats,
Mhm.
and either they shut down the streaming service tomorrow for 6 months or a year or whatever, right? But eventually it pops back up, and it's either called Beats or it's called iTunes on the go, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, what do you think that means for iTunes? iTunes of today.
I think that as we were just discussing this, I can't imagine they're going to get rid of it. Now, I wonder if, so Spotify and RDO, and I haven't tried it on Beats, but they allow you to store songs for when you're on the subway.
Right.
I wonder if Apple uh, doesn't allow that and makes it so you have to buy them to do that.
Right, and
And that's
I
how
don't
they
know that
keep
there's anything
iTunes.
wrong with that, right? That would be frustrating, I suppose. But
I think that's I think that's a very, very bad move on their part if they do that. Whenever you're the last person to, not allow something,
right,
um, you're on the bad end. I think Apple's smarter than that.
I do too. So I just wonder what they would do. I mean, there's no way that they ever shut that down, right? Because people also buy TV and movies and whatever
Yeah.
and apps through
And
the iTunes store.
that's the interesting thing too. Is somebody was telling a friend of mine was telling me the other day. I don't have this confirmed, but that sector is growing while their iTunes downloads is growing, which is also funny timing for this too. That what do you call it? Like some people said that this was a deflection because iTunes is going to come out with shrinking numbers, and they wanted to show that they're moving forward to their investors.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's not like it's not a bad thing of Apple to want to go, hey, like you guys asked for streaming, we have your solution now.
I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying when you have to answer to a board and they see that iTunes is dying, that's a scary thing for board members.
Absolutely, and that's why I think if you take the full picture of you get these shiny new headphones, and you get the streaming service. Well, that's pretty attractive, but there's still clearly such a large, there are way more people in the world that have no idea what Spotify is than that do. My mom, my dad have no idea what that is, or maybe they've heard about it on like the Today Show, but they have no idea.
You don't push it on them like I do?
No, there's just no point.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they know, like, everyone reads about what Apple does once or twice a year when they open a paper, right? If it's like an older person or whatever, whether it's a paper or something online, right? There are a lot more people talk about Apple than they do about Spotify because Apple is this massive thing, and these other companies are big to us, but they're not really that big in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. So if Apple in 6 months, in a year, whatever, comes out with their Spotify competitor powered by Beats, and all you have to do with your new iPhone is scan your fingerprint into your iTunes store, and all of a sudden you're paying $5 or $10 a month or $100 a year for this service, there's this whole other bridge of like a stampede of people who might find using it so much easier. And then, oh my God, it's incredible. I can just type in whatever and find this song from 30 years ago. That was such a joy of iTunes when it debuted 10 years ago, but can be refound now,
And instantly too, which is the coolest part. I mean, as somebody who's 36 years old, there's nothing cooler than remembering a song from 1994 by an obscure punk band from Gainesville, Florida, and seeing that you can listen to it right then and there is, another one of the greatest things to happen to music, and a whole new realm of people finding that is really going to change the world and probably also bring out some really cool hidden gems. Like one of my favorite things, So this week I saw the band Slint live, and
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
So what's Slint? There I go. There I
go. So Zack, Slint's a band from before you were born.
Okay.
They never played a show after their amazing record Spiderland came out. So Slint, I would argue to say that if you're into like that, the world is a beautiful place, if we're calling that like style emo, if we're calling that emo, they invented it pretty much. They invented the weird Algernon Cadwallader, or however you say that band's name, like type of strumming Twinkle Daddies type emo thing. And so that record was like a legend. Like when I was growing up, it's like no one knew anything about them. And so they just had a movie called Breadcrumb Trail come out about them that is one of the best. You don't even have to like the band to just see this movie is the funniest music movie, and it's so cool. But it's one of those records that just word of mouth, they said it for years while records still sold. It would just sell more copies every year, even though the band didn't exist.
Right.
And, I forgot what my original point was and why I brought up Slint now.
But I think you just like finding a band like Slint online, maybe.
Yeah. Like, that like Slint or that band Death, like the idea that you can have these gems get uncovered, even though the band's not, we're going to see a whole new generation of that come about when we're able to have, the writer Douglas Wolk called it the celestial jukebox, like that's available to everybody. There's going to be so many forgotten records that are going to just get huge.
Yeah, I mean something like American football even gets so much easier, right? If you see 10 bands talk about it on Tumblr, you reblog a song on Tumblr, and it's like, wow, I love this song. Never meant. Instead of opening up, whatever different streaming service, just it's on iTunes. Cool, I can just stream it on iTunes.
Yeah.
For me, I rarely buy music digitally, right? I'll buy something on Bandcamp if I'm just like if the band's really small and I like it and I want to hear it and they don't have vinyl or there's no way I'm going to buy that on vinyl. But I do buy a lot of records on vinyl and those all
Yeah.
come with digital download codes. So that's unless I'm getting like an advance of music, that's usually how like new music is being downloaded onto my computer, right? So to me, like it doesn't really matter if something like iTunes Store goes away, even though I think there's no chance it will. But to me, it's just like, well, that's not how I download music. I buy a physical record.
Yeah.
But I know I would stream so much more music if it was built into iTunes. So it's definitely, I would love that just because iTunes I have open all day long, and that's where I listen to music or podcasts or whatever. I don't really like to have like I use Rdio when I want to stream music, but I just wish it could all be in one,
Yes.
And so I think it would be just truly for the sake of ease, right? It's just one less thing for you to do. And again, if you have something like a fingerprint scanner or touch ID thing on your iPhone, and it's just like, oh yeah, cool, I'll do a 4-month trial of $3 a month, whatever it
Yeah.
is. It's just like that's an impulse buy, and that's
Yeah.
great. That's perfect. And it's not like Apple isn't gonna have you can buy this album for $9.99 by tapping here. They're gonna have that, and I think it's sort of hedging a bet that they do have those 800 million credit cards. Like if Apple does it right, they could sort of really like break this streaming game open into a different level, right? And that's the difference. That's the difference. Like Spotify and Rdio, millions of people use it, but it's nothing compared to, how many people could potentially use it. And, we're sort of waiting for an Amazon or a Google or an Apple to bust it open for everyone. So this could be that. And
I think you're using the wrong word there. Not could. This is that. This is basically what we just saw is the death of download. Music will be all about streaming. If your marketing plan or your life's about downloads and that's how you're thinking about you're going to make your music, it officially became obsolete on Thursday. That is now a thing that's on life support. It's going to be done. And
yeah, as long as Apple would implement it right, yeah, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean,
there's no chance Apple doesn't innovate it right. I mean, maybe that's the fanboy in me talking, but I think
it's just such a large opportunity, especially if you're coupling it with something like every iPhone you buy now comes with whatever their version of Beats is. Like I would if Apple transitions like their earbuds into something like Beats. Like Beats earbuds, like I don't care. Sure, I'm in. Like they look cool. I only look cooler, right?
Yes.
If there's an option when I buy my iPhone to spend $30 more instead of getting the free in-ear ones to get the over-the-ear ones, all right, whatever, cool. That's easy. It's an easy buy because the phone itself is $400. Sure, I'll spend an extra 30.
Yep.
I think it could be great.
I think so too. So do we want to do recommendations?
Yeah.
What do you got?
What do you got? Give me a sec. What do you got?
Well, I kind of said it before. If Slint is playing in your town, that was one of the greatest shows I've seen. And their movie Breadcrumb Trail about their history is a must see. I mentioned before I loved Palo Alto last night. Music wise, the funny story is there's this guy J Paul, Jaipaul, and he has these leaked demos that apparently the story goes his brother put up online. He's been signed to XL, which is the biggest indie label in the world, for 4 years and has only put out 2 songs. So 15 of them leaked out, and they are the greatest thing I've heard in a long time. So Not to encourage illegal music downloading, since that's the only way you can get it, but I encourage this illegal music download since it's just some of the most amazing music I've ever heard in my life.
Fair enough. I this week there are two younger bands, I guess. One band's called Sorority Noise.
I like that name.
They are a side project, but definitely like a full intentional band from the singer of Old Gray, and it kind of fits in well if you like something like modern baseball. They have an album coming out on May 13th called Forgettable. It's good. And then there's another band called Marietta that released an album last year called Summer Death that is very twinkly with a lot of emo. It's not something that I would necessarily typically love, but it just kind of hits that spot. So I think that works for me.
Awesome. I like twinkly as a adjective now too for music.
Yeah, it's just recommend if you like twinkly.
Very cool.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to find out more about the show, go to offtherecord.fm, and if you're looking for show notes, go to offtherecord.fm/tag/episode. You can find Jesse on Twitter at Jesse Cannon, and you can find me at Zarrillo. Make sure to subscribe or rate us on iTunes if you can. That helps a lot, and we'll be back soon.